year's first. If you're not a member yet, we invite you to join. Please put your questions and comments in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of the program. It'll be helpful if you place a Q in front of your question and a C in front of your comments. At our annual meeting this June, our members approved the addition of the policy of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. Moving forward, the League will examine everything we do, our programs, events, initiatives, through a DEI lens in order to gauge the perspective of different communities, different voices, and different views. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Tema Okun, has much to teach us about white supremacy, racism, and particularly the state white people have in racial equity. With 30 plus years of experience working with schools, organizations, and community-based institutions focused on racial injustice and equity, Dr. Okun has taught students in the undergraduate, master's, and doctoral level in educational leadership and education. She also advises leaders throughout the country. The award-winning Emperor Has No Clothes, Teaching About Race and Racism to People Who Don't Want to Know is her latest book. Currently, she's with the Teach Equity Now Collaborative at Duke. Dr. Okun, we are delighted and honored to have you with us this evening, and the virtual podium is now yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here as a woman voter, a white woman voter. And I want to say a few things as we get started. If there's any way at all for you to have your video on, it really helps me when I'm talking to be able to see you or to have a sense that I'm in a room with other people. So I feel like I'm muted. So I'll start over. I don't know when I got muted there. I'm very, very happy to be here as a woman voter, a white woman voter. And I was asking if it's at all possible for you to have your video on. That would be really helpful to me so I can get a sense that I'm in a room with other people and I can see your beautiful faces. So before we even start, or before I start to make any kind of remarks, I really actually want to give you a chance to talk to each other. So we're going to break into pairs or maybe groups of 3, if it will, depending on our numbers. And I want to give you 5 minutes to talk to each other about the question, what is the League's stake in racial justice? What is the League's, the League of Women Voters' stake in racial justice? And if you finish that question, then you can go on and talk about what's your stake, what's your personal stake in racial justice. So I'll give you, we're going to meet in small groups. We'll give you 5 minutes. Just make sure everybody gets a chance to contribute, and I'll see you and we'll share that when you get back. So you'll get an invitation to join a group, and don't worry, we'll bring you back. You don't have to worry about coming back. June and Pat and Tom, did you get a message asking you to join a group, a pair? Let's see if I can see. Okay, here we go. Okay, June, it says you're supposed to go to room 1. Do you see that on your computer? Do you see an invitation? No? Let me try and move you to another room and see if that helps. Let me try to move you to room 3 and let's see if you get another invitation. Do you see an invitation? Here we go. And Tom, are you there? Sometimes people aren't there. If you're not there, if you're there, you can unmute yourself. If you're not there, you're not there. Great. Yay.
I kind of overstacked the rooms just in
Fine.
case people had issues.
Totally fine. It's totally does not matter at all.
Awesome. All right, I'm here in the background if you need me.
Okay. Okay, I see somebody's come in, so we can admit them.
Okay, and as soon as they come in, do you want to just tell them a little bit and then I'll
Yeah.
drop them into a room?
Sure. Linda, are you there? Can you hear me? People are meeting in small groups, which is why you don't see anyone, and we're happy to put you in one if you want to let us know that you're there. So I'm going to go ahead and assign you to room 1. And if you want to accept, you can do that. There we go. And if you don't want to accept, you can just wait and people will be back in about, oh, June, you're back. What happened? It's all right. You can just hang on. Well, people will be back in about 2 minutes. Unless you want me to try and move you back? June? Can you unmute? It's all right. We'll just wait. They'll be back in about a minute and a half. Oh, yeah, that's right. You just unmuted yourself. So that's good. Linda, where people are in small groups, which is why you're only seeing a few people. And they'll be back in about less than a minute. So we'll just wait. What they're doing is they're talking about what the league's stake is in racial justice. And then if they finish that question, what their individual stake is. So you can think about that because we'll talk about it a little bit afterwards. So June, I can hear you now if you want to say something. Did you get kicked out of your group? You can just talk. I can hear you. You're unmuted. If you want to. Or you can just relax. 7 more seconds. Oh, actually, 1 more minute. I have 1 minute left. I always forget about that part. Okay, 6 seconds.
What is the full name of the program? Diversity and what else?
You know,
Wanda?
I don't know what the official name is.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, hi, Harry. Okay, I can see everybody now.
Yeah, now we're all back. Welcome back. So this is what I would like, this is the way we're going to do this. And I hope you're familiar with this. And if you're not, we'll get familiar. So you, at the bottom of your screen, you have a little icon that says chat. So if you open that up, I'd like you to open it up. I like to use the chat a lot. So we're going to start by using the chat, and in the chat, you can put anything that came up for you in your conversation that you want to share, or you can put the word stack, S-T-A-C-K, stack. And if you put the word stack in the chat, then I'll know to go to call on you. So it's at the very bottom. Yeah, John, it's at the bottom. Yeah.
I'm sorry, would you repeat what it means to put the word stack in?
It means that you want to speak.
I don't see it either.
Oh,
You want
thanks.
to-
And it doesn't come up
There
on
it
the
is.
bottom either.
There it
No,
is.
that's start video. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
And if you're not muted, it would be great if you could mute yourself, just because that way we can. So just start putting some things in the chat to let me know that you know how to use it, that we can all use it. You can say, we had a good conversation, or this came up for us, or I have this question. So everybody put a little something in the chat to let me know what went on for you in your conversation. Were you able to identify a stake? And if so, what was it? And if you want to talk about it, put the word stack. So democracy is at stake for sure. Voters' rights, equality, freedom. Yeah, yeah. I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. Yes, voting and education are very big stakes. Yeah. Anybody want to share with your voice? Redistricting, the growth of the league is to aid all the ideals. And yes, and more able to push your mission of voter rights. Yes. Yes. So voter rights and racial justice are inextricably linked for sure. Any brave soul want to speak out loud? So you can get a voice and can hear from somebody besides me.
There was a person in my group that was from Texas originally and just came back from visiting and could appreciate Charlotte based on what had been there.
Yep.
But I had felt that we were actually going backwards rather than forwards in what
Yes.
we've accomplished.
Yeah, we are definitely in a time of great backlash for sure. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm going to talk to you, at you, with you for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. There's a little video I want to share in the middle. And then I would love you to keep the chat open, because if something I say raises a question for you, or you want to comment on it, I am happy for you to be making comments in the chat as I'm talking. And then when I'm done, if we're going to open it up for questions and answers and discussion. Okay. So what I want to say to start, so there's some things that I want to say to you about white supremacy and racism and racial justice. And I'm not assuming you don't already know these things. I always like to start by making sure that we have some understanding about these terms, white supremacy and racism. So I'm going to start by saying that race is not biologically real, that it was constructed. It's a social and political construct. And an example I like to think about, another example of a very powerful, so while it's not scientifically real, it's very real socially and politically. And another example of what I'm talking about is geographical boundaries. They're not real. I mean, if you're up in space, you don't see lines, that demarcate countries and states. They're not real. We have created them as human beings. The power elite who govern have created these boundaries, and they have very, very real implications, and race is like that. So the idea of race was constructed, again, not as some kind of um, uh, uh, not out of any kind of appreciation for diversity. It was constructed by those with institutional and cultural power as I call it a pseudo-scientific strategy. And the goal of the strategy was and is to categorize groups of people by value, with Euro-Caucasian or
I don't know
white
what you're doing. I don't know what I'm
value
doing.
hierarchy. So again, the goal of constructing race was to categorize people by value with white at the top. And this idea of race started in Europe, and the power elite here in the US really refined it. In the US, we really refined it, and we really solidified this idea of a white race. And we did that in service of racial solidarity, because the power elite, who at the time, before the colonies were even, before we were even a nation, we were colonies, and a lot of our laws were being developed in Virginia. At the time, the people were coming here by nationality, from Europe by nationality. So people were coming from England, people were coming from France, people were coming from Holland, people eventually came from Germany, and they identified, they came from Scotland, that they came from, and people identified by nationality. And yet the landowners, the more powerful people, were completely outnumbered. We're outnumbered by indigenous people, outnumbered by unlanded Europeans, and outnumbered by people that they were being brought forcibly for enslavement. So this idea of white got named and really refined here. And it was constructed as a divide and conquer strategy to consolidate power and to consolidate profit. That's the purpose of it. There's no biological difference. We're all 97% genetically the same, and our differences are not associated with race. And one of the ways that I like to really emphasize this is with the story of John Punch, which some of you may know. In 1640, before slavery was really embedded in our economy, as it was just starting to I'm sorry. It was just starting to grab hold. A lot of poor people from Europe and people who came from Africa, not necessarily forcibly, were working as indentured servants. And the idea was that it was a very harsh life. And the idea was that after a period of time, you would be freed. And so three of them, a Scotchman, a Dutchman, and a man named John Punch, who at the time was referred to as a Negro, the three of them were working for a man named Hugh Gwynn, who was a very apparently mean and cruel landowner and boss, and they ran away together. All three of them ran away together to try to escape to Maryland. But they were caught and brought back, and the court, which was of course all white men at the time, the court sentenced them all to 30 lashes, which was actually quite a severe punishment for anyone at that time. And then they sentenced the Scotchman and the Dutchman to, I think, 4 more years of indentured servitude, and they sentenced John Punch to a lifetime of servitude. So they sentenced him to slavery. And so the word white wasn't in use yet. We hadn't invented the word white, and yet the court starts to embed white privilege into its rulings. And I think about this story a lot, because I think about these three people, these three men who decided to take a really big risk and run away together. So they must have had some kind of relationship and some kind of trust in each other. They get caught and they come back, and the three of them are sitting in the courtroom, and the Scotchman and the Dutchman are witnessing how they're getting a lighter sentence, and John Punch is witnessing it too. And you know, what happens in that moment? What happens in that moment when the court, who has the power, says to the people who are going to be white, well, you know what, we're going to punish you, but we're going to give you a chance. Once you're done being punished, you're going to have a chance for a better life. But John Punch, actually, we're going to punish you so severely, you'll never be free. And these three friends, what happened to them? What happened to their relationship? This is the epitome of divide and conquer. It's the epitome of saying to these three people who had very little formal power, you know, we can really screw with you. We can really make it so that you start to see each other as racial beings. You start to assume in some kind of way that to be white confers more power and privilege, and to be Black confers a lifetime of enslavement and punishment. And what do they do? Do the Scotchmen and the Dutchmen try and figure out a way to stay in solidarity with John Punch? Do they actually come up with some stories to try and justify why they got a lighter sentence, and they pass those stories on to their children? How does John Punch make sense of it? So I use the story because I think it's so important for us to understand that the incredible deviousness of white supremacy and racism in its mission to disconnect and divide people from each other. So in service of power and profit for a few at the expense of the very many. So then whiteness starts about 100 years later, the word white starts to show up in Virginia law, and it was created to offer some material benefits, although even those are limited to a select few, and almost if not more important, to establish psychic ones, right? Which we see in the John Punch story, to start to introduce this idea that associating with whiteness means that you get something. You're both normal and you're better, and you deserve what you get. And if you don't get it, you should be resentful. And the people you should be resentful of are the folks who we have already excluded, rather than the ones who are making the rules about what you do and don't get. So there's this ideology, and it's sometimes overt. And in this decade, since the Trump years, it's become way more overt than it used to be. It's also always very covert, that associates white with value, white with safety, white with trustworthiness, white with validity, white with qualified, white with with good, and black with dangerous, criminal, black and brown with dangerous, criminal, untrustworthy, all the negative messages, and other racialized. So the way the race construct works is that white is always at the top, black is always at the bottom. So when you hear the term anti-black racism, that's what it's referring to. And other racialized groups are moved up and down based on what the power elite need at any given moment. So if we think about 9/11, before 9/11, people of Arab descent in this country were very close to white. And now, after 9/11, to be Arab in this country is to be Muslim, is to be a terrorist. And that's somewhat of an exaggeration, but not really. So it's the way in which the power elite, the ones who control government, are able to use institutional policies and practices and shape culture to get us to internalize these associations with racialized groups of people. And I want to be clear that even though the power elite constructed race to benefit the white group, and particularly a select subset of the white group, at the expense always of people in communities of color, and often at the expense of poor white people, this construct is completely toxic to all of us. There is nothing good for us about being, those of us in the white group, there is nothing good for us about being positioned as both normal and better, when that being both normal and better comes at the expense and the violent violation of whole groups of people, which is what our situation is. Some of you may know, and let me share my screen for a minute. If people have heard of me, they've generally heard of me because I wrote an article over 20 years ago with a lot of help from a lot of people about white supremacy culture, about the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And earlier this year, I published a website. So let me just share my screen so you can see it. That goes into some depth. It's called, the address is, you can see at the top, is White Supremacy Culture Info, and it's called Divorcing White Supremacy Culture, Coming Home to Who We Really Are. And at the very bottom, if you scroll through, it starts to talk about the characteristics that that we internalize when we are operating out of our white supremacy conditioning. So we operate out of fear, we operate out of perfectionism, out of believing there's one right way to do something. We operate out of either or thinking, and there's a lot more here. And my basic argument is that these ways of operating, these conditioned ways of operating, do not actually serve us. And in that vein, I don't know how to do that. I wanted to share one other thing. because I think she says it better than I can. So I'm going to share a clip of a quick video. It's Toni Morrison being interviewed by Charlie Rose before he was Me Too'd off of television. And she's talking about white people having a very serious problem. So let me share my screen and we'll watch that. And then I'll say a few more things.
That's right.
Arthur Ashe was here, the late Arthur
Oh,
Ashe.
yes.
And he said to me, as he said in one other place, he said, in a much quoted comment, he said, living with AIDS is easier than living with racism. It's a harder struggle against racism for me than it is against AIDS. What it meant to me is that there's no way for the rest of us to understand that daily encounter. Which brings me to my question to you. Do you still have that encounter? Do you, Toni Morrison, Pulitzer Prize winner, successful, honored in the halls of academia, etc., still have that encounter?
Yes, I do, Charlie, but let me tell you, that's the wrong question.
Okay, what's the right question?
How do you feel? Not you, Charlie Rose,
Right.
but don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism,
Right.
are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and a distortion. It's a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. It feels crazy. It is crazy. And it has just as much of a deleterious effect on white people and possibly equal as it does Black people. I always knew that I had the moral high ground all my life. I always thought those people who said I couldn't come in the drugstore and I had to sit in this funny place, I couldn't
You
go in
felt
the
morally
park.
superior to them
I
from day
did.
one.
And I thought they knew that I knew that they were inferior to me morally. I always thought that. And my parents always thought that.
You said your father was racist because he always felt like he was
He always
superior.
thought, that's right. He always felt superior. And that was a form, of defensive racism. But if the racist white person, I don't mean the person who is examining his consciousness and so on, doesn't understand that he or she is also a race. It's also constructed. It's also made. And it also has some kind of serviceability. But when you take it away, I take your race away. And there you are, all strung out. And all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? You still smart? You still like yourself? I mean, these are the questions. It's part of it is, yes, the victim, how terrible it has been for Black
But you don't
people.
like that.
I'm not a victim. I refuse to be one.
And the victim is the other person who is morally inferior and
That's
who
that's a
has
serious
to hold
question.
on to
Of course.
racism
If you
to
have to
somehow
hold, that's
for
it.
his or her own self-esteem and definition.
If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
Then give white people some free advice.
They're all in my books.
Okay. So I show that because I think it's so important for us to
Rapport.
oh, sorry, to see, to start to think about the way that white supremacy and racism are toxic to all of us, so that we can understand that we all have a stake in it. And I ask the stake question everywhere I'm invited to talk, because I think it's really, really important for those of us in the white group to be really, really clear that we have a direct stake in racial justice, that it's not about some moral imperative to help people of color access whiteness, because whiteness is not actually something that any of us should aspire to. So whiteness as it's constructed in this toxic way. And the other thing I want to say is that and I also think it's really important for those of us in the white group to be clear about our stake, because it is generally, if not always, very clear to Black, Indigenous, people of color, communities of color, what their stake is because of the forceful way that white supremacy and racism violate people and communities. So it's the deviousness of white supremacy and racism is how they hide the toxicity to those of us in the white group. And some of the evidence of that is the incredibly high levels of addiction, depression, suicide, homicide, all the ways in which white people are, the rates of our self-implosion are higher than they've ever been, and getting higher and higher. And we are also seeing white supremacy emerge forcefully now into the mainstream. And it's both coded and overt. And people, you refer to it in your stake as a league. So we see more and more laws encouraging voter suppression, the outlawing of critical race theory in our schools, propaganda, outright propaganda presented as facts in the face of clear evidence that disparities based on race and class are growing ever wider and ever more entrenched. We're seeing globally the emergence of a global autocracy, which is driven by power and profit. And the US, we're on the cusp of joining other world players being taken over by people and interests who are ruling for power and have no interest in democracy, democratic governance, or global well-being. Now, I know that the League is nonpartisan. And I also know that we're seeing right in front of our eyes one mainstream political party that's embracing strategies that are slowly but surely meant to dismantle, to capture government at the expense of democracy. And they're doing this using classic historic racist tactics and rhetoric. They talk about the dangers of voter fraud, which there are, the research has proven over and over and again that there is no danger of voter fraud. Those accusations and the gerrymandering and the attempts to make it harder for Black and brown people to vote are just a repeat of attempts since we became a nation to limit the voting power of Black and brown people in the past, using poll taxes and literacy tests and all kinds of ways to make sure people couldn't vote if they weren't going to vote in the way that the power elite wanted them to. They're passing laws to outlaw any admission that we have a racist past. And again, this mimics the historically racist patterns of school curriculum that leaves out the experience of the enslaved, the indigenous, those whose labor fueled capitalism. We're witness to the drastic undermining of democratic decision-making using well-worn tactics, stoking fear of the racialized other as dangerous and a threat to our way of life. We're willing to separate children from their parents in the name of this kind of racialized fear, and people are being encouraged into new levels of mass lawlessness at the Capitol, on our southern border. Some of the recent anti-abortion law that was passed in Texas gives citizens unbelievable rights to invade and harm other citizens. It's kind of mind-blowing. So what we know is that democracy is at great risk right now. And one of the reasons is how white supremacy and racism are being used to organize white voters, and white women voters in particular, into a racist framework that insists Black and brown people are a threat, their right to vote is a threat, their ability to inform the hysterical narrative is a threat, their immigrant labor is a threat. And I need to be clear that the research shows that the numbers of white women voting for candidates committed to this resurgence of overt white nationalism and racism is growing. And again, I'm not making a partisan point. I'm talking about how we, those of us who are white women voters, and as a league of women voters, have a very deep responsibility to those white women, and an even deeper responsibility to ourselves to step up in this situation, to show up in this situation, and to say, as a voter, and if we're white and if we're white women, as a white women voter, I am deeply, 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 deeply concerned about the future of democracy. And the complete irony to me is that many of the candidates that this majority of white women are putting into office don't really care about women, don't really care about children, don't really care about families. We're not even voting in our own best interests. And the flip side of this is that those most targeted by this white supremacy racist agenda are Black and brown men and women, Indigenous men and women, immigrant men and women, and white poor men and women who are white. Anybody who doesn't fit the picture of American. And we need to realize, again, those of us who are in the League and those of us who are white women, that our fate, the fate of democracy, is directly tied to the fate of Black and brown and poor people and communities, because as they go, so go we eventually. And this implosion is, I think, reflected in the truth of the devastating realities of our current situation. So we have overwhelming cases of COVID, disproportionately affecting people of color and poor people. We have increased joblessness, homelessness, physical and mental disease, addiction, isolation, depression, increasing disparities based on race and class. The wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, has only gotten larger in my adult lifetime. Increasing hostility, decreasing ability to care for one another or even ourselves. It's gotten so that it's not popular for people to care for each other. So we're imploding. We're imploding because the logical consequence of white supremacy and racism is that the very people who are supposed to benefit become so twisted that we can't see beyond our own gated community. We actually hang on to the belief that we can be happy while others are suffering. We hang on to the belief that we can be happy as a result of other people's suffering. And the truth is, we'll never thrive if we don't grasp that we all do better when we all do better. We're not thriving now as a nation, and certainly not as a community of women. So I always come back to the truth of the thing, which is that our fates are inextricably tied, and that our survival as a democracy, as a nation, as a community, depends on our ability to understand the ways in which racist rhetoric and practice is driving a wedge between us in the service of power and profit, in the name of power and profit, not in the name of anything else. And I think you all, a few of you named this earlier, I think the situation is very dire. And the question that's facing us and facing us as white women voters, those of us who are white women, is what do we do to make it clear that we will not be divided and we will not be conquered by these well-worn white supremacy racist tactics? And what would it mean for an organization like the League to center the interests of BIPOC women voters rather than simply include them? How would those of us who are white in the League benefit from a kind of relational and transformational approach to safeguarding democracy, given that it is and always has been Black, Indigenous, and women of color who have the most to lose when democracy falters? So I think that the League needs to understand how white supremacy and racism are being used to distort democracy, needs to ask, what does democracy require right now? Needs to understand that white supremacy is a project of disconnect. It serves to disconnect people across lines of race. It serves to disconnect people within their own racial groups. It serves to disconnect me from myself, me from God or spirit or divine or creativity, if you don't believe in God, from the earth. And from, from this democratic impulse. So what does democracy need from us right now? And I think it needs us to love our neighbors as ourselves and assert an ethos of love and care in the face of this rising right-wing fear and hatred. So that's what I wanted to say. And I'm very open now to questions or comments or thoughts, and I'll take a look at the chat, which I didn't have a chance to do as I was talking. So if you have a question, you can either, there's so few of us. There's only one screen worth of us, which is lovely. So you can either put it in the chat or you could just unmute yourself and ask the question or make your comment.
Tema, there's a question about where did you get the title for your book, The Emperor Has No Clothes?
Well, again, I think it's, do people know the story of the emperor having no clothes? So it's an old folk tale, and the emperor wants these fancy clothes and hires these, and the tailors pretend to be making him the most fabulous outfit ever, and there's nothing. So he ends up walking through town naked, and nobody wants to say so because they're scared. They're scared to speak the truth in front of the powerful emperor. And a young child goes, look, he's naked, he has no clothes. And so I think that's what white supremacy and racism are. It's like that we're terrified to talk about it. It's everywhere. It's the water that we swim in our culture. Our capitalist economy was built on white supremacy and racism, the theft of land and the theft of labor, and the violation of whole communities of people. And so, I think it's to me, it's this idea that we need to be the young child. We need to say out loud, this is what's happening, and it's not in anybody's interest. It's certainly not in the emperor's interest to be walking naked, and it's certainly not in the community's interest to have to look at the emperor walking around naked when it has nothing to do with them. So that's where it came from.
Thank you. There's another question. We'd like you to comment on. She says that some leaders' advice seem to be to not speak out in the critical race theory fight because it just provides the opposition more publicity. It didn't seem to work. So lots of laws have been passed without aggressive opposition. So she'd like you to comment on that.
Well, the only thing I disagree with is I think there has been quite, in every case where the laws were passed, there has been, people have been fighting. And in fact, there was a wonderful, I'm not going to remember geographically where it was. Was it in, I don't even remember what state it was, but a whole group of students, a local school board passed a policy saying that there were including a whole list of books that centered Black and brown children couldn't be used in school anymore. And the students, I think it was high school students, led days of protest, and the school board had to give in and put the list back put the books back on the shelves. It's an amazing story. So there's stories of victories that we don't often hear. And I think there has been a lot of people gathering together to try and oppose this. I think that the way that we are so divided now, the way that people are getting such, my mother taught me to distinguish between people who know better and people who don't. And what I mean by that is that I think some people who are caught up in this fight against critical race theory or against anything that makes much sense are caught up because they're being fed really bad information and they have no reason to know differently. And but the people who know better are the people who are feeding them the information. So I make a distinction between those two people. I make a distinction between Mitch McConnell and maybe one of the people who was storming the Capitol because they thought that's what they were supposed to do, right? And so I think that the part of your job as a league that's as an organization that's really concerned about people's right to vote is to make sure that you are doing everything in your power to provide a counter narrative, to provide a narrative about why everybody deserves to vote, everybody has a right to vote, how whatever it is that you want to say about what it means to try to govern in a way that strips people of their rights versus what it means to govern in a way that respects people's voice. And I think so. I think that the right is very good at the narrative, and we're not so good. We haven't gotten as good at the narrative and about claiming our rights and our desires to be able to fully participate in governing our own lives. I think the other thing that is interesting to me is that the extreme right is very, 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 very clear that their agenda is to capture government. And I think a lot of us on the more moderate or liberal side are very caught up in still trying to say, well, we're nonpartisan, or we're not going to take a side, and we're not willing to say, actually, we want to be government. We want government for, by, and of the people. That's what we want. So I think we need to become more bold about what it is that we want and stop being so scared about taking a position, particularly now when I think democracy is really under threat. So, yeah, and then there is a huge misunderstanding that DEI work and critical race theory are the same. They're not the same. So diversity, equity, inclusion, there's so many ways to support equity. I really don't like the word inclusion at all. And I try to encourage people not to use it because it begs the question, who are we including and what are we including them into? And I think that to me, what I've learned, I do a lot of work in schools, and what I've come to understand is that the default position around racial equity, if we don't really look at it closely, the default position is the assumption that the goal is to lift Black and brown people into whiteness. And I just want to cut through that. That's not the goal at all. I don't think whiteness serves anyone. It doesn't serve white kids in school. So I think when we talk about inclusion, we need to ask including what, who, into what, on whose terms, for what. So I really like the word equity. I think that we should be working towards equity and this idea that we all do better when we all do better, and we all need different things to do better. We don't all need exactly the same thing. And critical race theory is an examination of the way that a critical look at the way that race was created and the consequences.
There's a question on the treatment of the Haitian people on the Texas border. She said it's another display of systematic racism against Black people, regardless of political party. Could you comment on that?
Well, I find it, I'm very appalled by it, and I'm nonpartisan in my criticism. So I do think that the Republican Party right now is being driven by a very right-wing agenda. And I think the Democratic Party has a lot of work to do as well on issues of racism, white supremacy and racism, and needs to be a lot more bold and clear. So I don't quite, I don't know if it's being, if Haitian people are being treated the way they are out of some kind of notion of pragmatism. I never quite understand when we mistreat people in this way, what the real justification for it is. So yeah, I'm not letting the Democratic Party off the hook here at all. I think that our governing parties have a lot of work to do. So yeah, that's what I would say.
There's a question on, the gentleman says, I've heard conservatives say that turning Black students against white students for past injustices is wrong.
Yeah, and then I see that Linda would like to speak. Well, let me speak to that, and then we can hear from Linda. That's not what's happening. To talk about our racist history is not turning anybody against anybody else. And so where the conservatives have done a really good job on the narrative is to say, if you want to talk about racism, then you're basically saying, talking about racism means that you're saying that white people are bad and Black and brown people are good, and that won't do. So let's not talk about it. And this is what they're so good at. They're so good at taking a very complex idea, because we live complex lives, and narrowing it down to this either or kind of thinking, which is why I think it's binary thinking. Either you're good or you're bad. And if we look at racism, then we're going to find out that we're bad. So let's not look at it. And to get people really scared, because there is already, I've been teaching this and learning about this and growing about this and learning myself about this for over 3 decades now. And underneath a lot of the reason that we're still in this boat is because so much of the agenda is fear driven, and the basic fear that we're all walking around with, and I'm generalizing here, so it may not apply to you, and I think it's generally true, is this deep, deep fear that we're going to find out deep down that we don't belong, that we're bad, that there's something wrong with us, that we're not enough, something in those areas. That's what white supremacy and racism have introduced us all to. I don't know, I study Buddhism, and I don't know if people know who the Dalai Lama is, but the Dalai Lama is a Tibetan Buddhist leader, very, very learned, very wise, very revered. And there's some Buddhist leaders from the US who went to visit him, and were talking to him asking him about self-hatred. And he goes, what are you talking about? And he didn't understand the concept of self-hatred. And self-hatred is very much a Western phenomenon, because it is tied to the way that white supremacy and racism drive us through fear. So I would say, if somebody says, this critical race theory is turning Black students against white students, I would just say that's completely that's nonsense. I teach critical race theory. What it does is it creates solidarity and understanding and stronger relationships and more ability to be with people who are different than you, and more ability to sit with the pain of my own participation in things I wish I hadn't participated in. Because the truth is, in my experience, when I cause somebody else harm, it feels crappy. It feels, I'm going to use a word, it feels shitty. I do not like making other people feel bad. I don't like it. And I don't think anybody really likes it. And so what we do, and if we feel like we have to do it, we cover it up with all these justifications. So what I think critical race theory does is it gives us a chance to dig underneath all of these layers of lies we've been telling ourselves and go, oh, okay, underneath there's a person here who just wants to be, loved in relationship with somebody else who wants to be loved. And we want to help each other. It's like we want to help each other. We want to help each other, which is such a foreign notion right now. It's like, I walk into places and I'm scared to ask people to put on their masks because I'm afraid they're going to get angry or get violent, because this idea that we should care for each other has become so foreign in our culture. So I just, when people say we're pitting people, if we talk about race, we're pitting people against each other, I say that's not my experience at all. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Okay.
Linda Trom has asked to speak to everyone. Linda, you just have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. When I heard the title of your book and was reminded of that story and the one person who was able to say the truth was a child, it kind of triggered me to think about, we hear a great deal of truth from children. Sometimes that's before they learn to kind of put themselves on mute, but I think it's really a valuable thought. And there were two lessons that I learned about I learned about racism, I guess I would say, and potentially my own contribution to that. And they were both from kids, and it was probably 20 something years ago when it happened. One young boy, a young African-American boy, he was about 14 maybe, and we were having a conversation. I was a counselor in a school. Oops. And what happened was I don't even know where it came up from. We were talking about people feeling fear. And he said, well, I know that white women feel fear when I walk down the street. And I thought, what is he talking about? It just didn't click with me. And he said, yes, I know that because they pull their purse in. They kind of wrap their arm closer to their purse. And he said, I've seen it. And I realized myself that I had done that. And I realized that it was like this thing I didn't even think about. It's just something I had, I guess, heard and learned, and nobody taught me it. I just was doing that. And it really brought me my awareness. Another thing was a little bit more simple, but we were having a group celebration. And in my small group, primarily African-American boys around, they were preteens, 11, 12-year-old place. And we were serving ice cream that's at the same school. And I actually am allergic to chocolate. I've been allergic to chocolate for probably, I don't know, since I can remember. So I haven't eaten it. And so we had that kind of ice cream that's 3 different flavors. And so I said, I was getting just the strawberry and the vanilla. And the little, this one young boy, his name's Scott, and he said to me, why aren't you getting chocolate? And I said, I'm allergic to chocolate, Scott. And he said, and he put his hand next to mine and he goes, are you allergic to me? And it struck me, it hurt. I felt such hurt. And I was like, of course not. But that was, that came up for him, and it came up from the most simple way. And I would have never thought about it. And so it brought my attention. And I think sometimes it just makes me think about really listening to our kids and see what their experience is, because those experiences really changed a lot of my perception.
Thank you, Linda. We're getting close to
I'm sorry.
7:30, the witching hour, so to speak. Your first comment reminded me of like the saying driving while black. And this is something going on in our country now that's just horrendous. And
Yeah.
I don't know, Tema, do you have a comment?
Yeah,
about that?
the only thing I want to say, again, so that we understand the gravity of what we're up against, is that children by the age of 3 understand that there's a race construct, and they understand where they are on it. And the other thing, so they understand not just that it's constructed, but where white is, where black is. They understand that, and regardless of the messages that they're getting at home, and a lot of what I know about those of us in white families is that we often, and it was true in my family, is we communicate with silence. If somebody notices something, or if a child is curious about race, we often answer in silence, which is the worst thing we can do, because we're communicating that there's something wrong with asking. The other thing I would say is that the way that systemic racism starts to happen is as early as kindergarten, that the proportion of Black children who are suspended in kindergarten is where the school to prison pipeline starts. And the statistics on the numbers of Black and brown children who were suspended at the age of 5, which is just the very definition of insanity. So the very same behavior in white children is not punished, and Black and brown children are punished for being enthusiastic and curious and energetic. And
Emma, would you do me a personal favor and tell the Me Too story?
okay. Well, and I think this is relevant to the league in terms of you all thinking about your responsibility or your role with white women voters, which is that the thing about white supremacy and racism is that it targets Black and brown people, and it also spreads over onto white working and poor people. Because if we, in the workshops that we do, when we talk about a framework, we talk about how racism is institutional, and it's cultural, and it's personal. And institutional racism has to do with the ways in which institutions exclude, underserve, exploit, which is a labor financial term, invalidate and violate people in communities of color. And there are many poor and working white people who are also excluded, underserved, exploited, invalidated, and violated. And it's just that as part of the white group, there's a dynamic that goes on that I've learned I'm part of the white group, and as part of the white group, I'm not supposed to be treated this way. So if I am being treated this way, then I need to blame somebody. And the way white supremacy and racism works is that the people you need to blame are Black and brown people, not the power elite who are doing this to you. So there's a lot of confusion. And so I was leading a white affinity group. So when we do workshops, we often split into a white affinity group and a people of color affinity group, and sometimes a mixed roots group if we have a facilitator to do that. And to talk about how our relationship as white people in the white affinity group to white supremacy and racism. And we had just gone through that, and a woman, without the explanation that I just gave, we had just talked about how racism excludes, underserves, and the list of things. And this white woman was leaning back in her chair and goes, that happens to me too. And in one of these moments of great insight, when I was facilitating, I thought, oh yeah. And here's what I want to say to her about it. I don't remember exactly how I said it to her, but what I said was, yes, and you know that white supremacy and racism are at work because your response to realizing that happens to you too is to be resentful. That we're talking about how it happens to Black and brown people, and you're feeling resentful because it happens to you too, and you're feeling like you're not being seen. Instead of, that's your conditioned response, and it makes all kinds of sense. And a connecting response would be, oh, wait, that happens to me too. Let me understand this, because that happens to me too. And now I have more of a window into the experience of my Black and brown brothers and sisters than somebody like, somebody who's wealthy, or somebody who's highly educated, or somebody who's, not that Black and brown people aren't highly educated, but somebody who's up the ladder. I actually am in a much better position to understand how racism operates. So that's again, that's just a reflection of the deviousness of how white supremacy and racism operate. Because our immediate response is like, well, I don't want to hear about your oppression because you're not seeing mine, as opposed to, oh, my experience of oppression really helps me understand yours.
Right.
We have one more comment, Tema, from Leah Talbert. Leah, would you like to unmute and ask your question or your comment?
Yes, I think my comment sort of responds to what Toni Morrison said. I think that until more and more and more white people who believe as we believe, unless they speak up, we might be doomed. Even though I'm optimistic, I'm still optimistic. I think it's really up to white people to make the change.
Yeah. Well, we all have a role to play, and I agree with you. And that's why I'm so focused on supporting those of us who are white to be really clear about our direct stake in this, as opposed to, thinking that our job is to help others. But our job is always to help others. But it's also like my humanity, my future, my happiness, my freedom depends on me speaking out and playing a role here. Yeah.
Whenever we talk about affordable housing in this city, too many folks revert back to the developers and the power the developers have.
Yeah.
How did the developers get this power?
Yeah.
How?
Well,
it just didn't happen. And
yeah.
it continues to happen because we allow it to happen. I'm not a powerful person. I can speak up, but there are white people more powerful than me who can definitely make the change, help make the change. But we've been talking about affordable housing for
a really long time.
Too long.
Yeah.
I just retired after working 30 years in human services, and we were talking about it before then.
Yeah.
So
I don't want to underestimate the power of the people, and because everything, I think about our ancestors who weren't able to see what they were fighting for come to fruition, and my deep gratitude and appreciation to them. And we have to be the ancestors for the people coming after us, and keep fighting the good fight, even if we know we're not going to see the result in our lifetime, and understand that everything that whatever freedom we have, freedom in our mind, freedom in our heart, freedom in our community, is because people like us fought for it, right? That's why. It's like our ancestors fought for it.
yeah.
And that's why we're here. So yeah, that's what we have to do. I completely agree.
Well, we're at that time, and I don't want to prevail on Tema's goodwill. So unless someone has something they really want to contribute, I guess we'll say goodnight. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate that you were able to, that you wanted to hear what I had to say. So thank you.
I would like to mention that we have Professor Dr. Jean Nickel at our upcoming Lunch with the League in October the 13th. That's at 11:30. So hope everybody will come here, Dr. Nickel.
Yep.
And thank you again. Okun. Great.
Bye.
Thank you.
So you said you had some music to play?
Sure, I'll play another song if you want. This is one of my favorites, if you want to stay on.
Play us out.
So
gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. Adelante. Siempre adelante, siempre adelante, sin volver atrás. Gonna keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Amaremos con pasión. Siempre con pasión, siempre con pasión, sin volver atrás, sin volver atrás. Gonna reach across our border, reach across our border. Reach across our border, never turning back, never turning back. Y vamos sin fronteras, siempre sin fronteras, siempre sin fronteras. Sin volver atrás, sin volver atrás. Gonna reunite the family, reunite the family, reunite the family. Never turning back, never turning back. Familias reunidas, siempre reunidas, siempre reunidas, sin volver atrás, sin volver atrás. Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. No, we're never turning back. Never turning back. Never turning back. Never turning back.
Whew.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Night. Thank you.